The most important issue here is the left believes in the possibility of a perfect world. They are dreaming, they are looking through the telescope backwards, right? They're looking into the future, and there will be paradise on earth. There will be a heaven on earth. There will be equality and fraternity and brotherhood, etc. However, there's a little problem. In order for this heaven to be built, the old earth has to be destroyed. I want to begin a little bit tonight with a little bit of a personal angle, because it's my story, it's my family's story that I think is very much essential to start with here tonight, because the themes of my family's life are very much interwoven with why I wrote this book and what this book is about. Because the left sacrifices human life on the altar of ideals, for the left, ideas come first and people come second. And oftentimes when they come second, it means that they're killed or they're imprisoned or they're found in a gulag. And we know that today in Iran or any other dictatorship. If you notice, my book was dedicated to a person named Grigory Rafalsky. And that was my granddad, my mother's dad. And in many respects, I want to start and I want to end today's discussion with saying one life. And I want to begin with saying that one life influenced and motivated, and it influenced the psychology of my family, because my granddad was a doctor in the Soviet army, and he went missing in action. He never came home, and we thought that he was lost to the Nazis. But we later discovered that he had refused to participate in torture that the NKVD was involved in on its own people, on its own dissidents, on its own side. And my granddad had refused to participate. And you understand, when a doctor comes in, he maybe would check a pulse or whatnot. And they took him into an alley or wherever they took him and shot him in the back of the head. And Grigory Rafalsky is in our family's consciousness, and in my mom's consciousness, in the sense that this is one life that was sacrificed for that totalitarian dream, because ultimately that's what it was. Because the Soviet Union, or whether my granddad would have been butchered by the Nazis during the war, I don't mean that it didn't matter, because it matters very much who killed my granddad. But at the same time, those two ideologies of Nazism and communism both believe ultimately that life has to be sacrificed for the sake of utopian ideals. And we have the same thing today with Islamism. It's just another mutated carbon copy, although I don't obviously negate that there's an Islamic influence as well. So I want to start with that a little bit today by saying that it is life, and my book began and is dedicated to one life, because what I believe in, and I think what we all believe in here tonight, is that life is sacred, and that every individual life is sacred, and that there's no future political dream or romantic fantasy world that justifies the killing of a human being. I grew up in an atmosphere of terror, and it wasn't because my parents didn't love me. My mom and my dad were both dissidents. My father more introduced this to my mother. My dad, from the time he was born, told me, and my family talks about it, that from the time he was a kid, he knew he lived in a slave camp. He felt that he was a slave and he didn't want to be a slave, and he understood this when he was 5, 6, and 7 years old. And I've been fascinated with this my whole life, because when I came to America, I smelt something as well, and I didn't understand what freedom was intellectually, but I could smell it as a young boy. And my dad used to look at maps, and he used to be trying to figure out what body of water he could swim across to escape the Soviet Union, because he did not want to be a slave. And I can't go on, because there would be hours and hours of this, but let it be said that my mom and dad ended up being young people that were signing petitions on behalf of dissidents. My mother was just a young girl in her 20s that secretly was typing on a typewriter samizdat and underground literature, and she was, you know, she risked her life. She could have ended up in a psychiatric hospital or in the Gulag, as we well know. And so this is what my parents stood for, and they stood for freedom, they stood up for human rights, and they lived under a barbaric regime that we all know massacred millions of people. And we were being persecuted and we were being hunted down. We had a loving couple that used to sit in front of our house, and they were always kissing and very romantically involved with each other. But there were two hints that they gave away very quickly. One, a romantic liaison, as we know, only lasts about 2 months until the fighting starts. So this has been going on for 2 years, and they're always within 30 meters of my father whenever he's walking around the streets of Moscow. And there were also these strange men in suits always in front of our apartment complex. And my dad would wave to them, even with a sense of humor, and became friends with them. Not as brazenly as Robert De Niro and Goodfellas would do, but there was this sense of humor my dad had under these crazy circumstances. And then one day my mother said, I'm going to go visit our neighbor now, because I have to. And my mom has a certain talent and sixth sense that perhaps is not of an issue tonight, but it's a great story in our family. And my mom had heard that our neighbor was going to commit suicide. And so my mom came to her door and knocked on the door and said, I have to come in now if you don't mind, because I know you're going to kill yourself, and I know that you're going to kill yourself because of my family. So before you kill yourself, it's very important for you to tell me why you're going to kill yourself as connected to my family's fate, and then if you wish you can do this. So the lady led her in and sat down, and before you knew it, the KGB had discovered that she had had an affair on her husband, and they were always monitoring people to find their weaknesses. And they had blackmailed her and told her that they were going to divulge this information to her husband unless she could do them a little favor by informing them about the Glazovs. And we had to get out of there right away in terms of my father realized that the arrest was imminent. It was 1972, it was during the Brezhnev-Nixon detente time, things were relaxing a little bit, and during that moment of, that opportunity of time, that moment of opportunity, they realized they wanted to throw some dissidents out rather than putting them in the Gulag. And we were one of the lucky ones that got out during that very, very split second of opportunity, I guess. I could never explain it, but it was magical. But I knew freedom from the moment I breathed it and smelt it, and I loved it. And my parents weren't afraid anymore, and we weren't waiting for a knock at the door, and I realized that my parents were reading books, and we weren't scared anymore, and etc., etc., etc. So I grew up loving the United States. And after a while, I began to run into this really strange species. They came from the universities, they would yell at my dad. They would call him a fascist and a racist. They would explain to me and to him that where we came from was a great place. We just didn't understand it. And where we were was a horrible place. It was evil. And I grew up with this my whole life, and I appreciate the laughter because it is funny, right? But it's so tragic. But for me, there was so much anger in my heart and confusion because I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand people that were explaining Stalin and explaining away Castro and explaining away Mao Zedong and even worshiping these tyrants. And they cheered for the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And they can deny it, and they can say that they didn't, and they can say lots of things. But they knew what was in their hearts. They knew what side they wanted to win. And they knew who they sided for. And you know, we have the revisionist historians. This was my interest as well. And I studied the Cold War, and during my doctorate years, this was my specialty. And in dealing with the left for so many years, you could smell, you know that there's something very putrid there. There's something very wrong there because there's never a concern for the truth. And for 10 years or 20 years, I had maybe naively argued with these people, but these people were my colleagues. And we argued about the Berlin Wall, and we argued about the beginning of the Korean War, and we argued about Vietnam, and we argued about the bomb, and we argued about everything. And then the archives came out, the Venona transcripts came out, the declassified documents proving the conservative position right, common sense, that the United States was the good guy in the Cold War. I mean, all you have to do is read the Gulag Archipelago and know which side was good or bad, but they didn't really get that. But when I came to my colleagues finally and said, look at this, look at the Venona transcripts here, look at this document here, look at this declassified document here, and they were like, oh, Glazov! Glazov is engaged in necrophilia. Glazov is chasing old ghosts. And these are historians that were ridiculing me for chasing old ghosts. This is only one story out of a million, but I knew something was wrong, that historians are ridiculing a person for digging up declassified documents from the archives. So anyway, I can go on, but you can understand that it was personal for me. You could understand that we lived our life worried about Vladimir Bukovsky and about Alexander Solzhenitsyn and about Alexander Ginsburg and about Armando Valadares in Cuba, and we lived with our hearts with these people and worrying about them and fighting for them, and the left didn't care, and they knew they didn't care. Just like today they don't care about the Nani Darwishes that have been left behind and about the Hirsi Alis that have been left behind. They don't care about those people behind the Islamist curtain. And then 9/11 happened, and now I'm reaching the book and why I wrote the book. I was scared to come out of my house because I am so This is so personal for me. When I saw those Twin Towers burning and I saw those people holding hands and jumping from those buildings, and what America to me in my heart is, what a beautiful country. And those towers to me represented freedom. They represented something so beautiful. They represented progress. They represented, if anything, multiculturalism, the success of different creeds and different religions and different colors of people all in one building, and prosperity and freedom. Who would want to destroy these towers? I was scared to walk out of my house because it was so personal to me that I have a lot of leftist friends and acquaintances, and I could already predict what was going to come out of their mouths, but I wasn't ready for it. But I ventured outside, and then I got it. You know, oh, the United States, you know, they really had this coming to them. And, oh, you know, the Americans are really mediaizing this. You know, now, what is that? I'm not even sure what it even means that the United States was even mediaizing. But you know the different tactics that are used. But there was, and I will tell you, there was a cheer, there was a glee. There was this feeling that there was the oppressed and the downtrodden had finally struck back. Finally, the United States got its just rewards. And I'll tell you, I knew some leftists that were devastated from the fall of the Soviet Union. These people were devastated. I can think of about 5 of them. And from 1991 to 2001, they walked around, just the life had been taken out of them. And a couple of them once said to me, there's no alternative to capitalism anymore. And then 9/11, and their chins were up, their chests were out, and finally something was happening again. And I knew something was very wrong. Norman Mailer calling the suicide bombers brilliant. You know, we had a German composer, Stockhausen, call 9/11 the greatest work of art for the cosmos. Eric Foner, Susan Sontag. How many people during that time came forward? Oliver Stone talking about, you know, whatever the theme was, the just desserts, the Civil War, the time to pay the bill had finally come. You know, Oliver Stone was talking about how the Palestinians celebrating was reminiscent of how the French and the Russians had celebrated after the revolutions. There was this thing in the left where something good had happened, where something just had finally happened. And I realized I had to finally put this down on paper, because it was something that was in my soul, in my guts for many, many years, for a lifetime, where I wanted to explain this psychology. The problem is when I was a bartender one time, this little lefty bartender I worked with that hated me came up to me one time and he said, "You're the reason people like you that communism doesn't work. And I'll never, that communism doesn't work.